Of what use is my life any longer? That was the substance of Elijah's prayer in 1 Kings 19. Basically, he says it this way. These are the words of it. I've had enough. Take away my life. I'm no better than my fathers. Here is Elijah, surprisingly, after great victories in 1 Kings chapter 18, now he's in a depressed state of mind, and he prays to God that he might take his life away from him. And we are somewhat surprised that Elijah would come to this particular point in life. He has just had a great victory over all of the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. He has run ahead of the chariot of Ahab that was drawn by horses all the way back to Jezreel, 6 miles distant in the pouring rain. Earlier than that, he had gone up to Sidon, the area of Sidon, that's Phoenicia, the country of Phoenicia, stayed with the widow of Zarephath, and he had resurrected her child from the dead through the power of God. And she was compelled to say this. She says, now I know that you're a man of God, and the word of God in your mouth is true because of the great miracle that he did. It was Elijah's word, according to James 5, verse 17, that the drought came upon them. His prayer had caused the drought, or brought the drought, and he prayed again, and the earth brought forth rain, or the heavens brought rain, the earth brought forth her fruit. What a great, powerful man of God. But here we find him in the very next chapter, chapter 19, now in a depressed state of mind, stating, he says, of what use is my life any longer? I've had enough. Take away my life. I don't need it any longer. I'm no better than my fathers. What had happened was, of course, that Jezebel, the very day that Ahab got back, according to the opening lines of chapter 19, when Ahab got back to Jezreel, that is the capital city in the north, and the summer home, he came back and reported to Jezebel, his wife, all that had occurred. And all of her prophets, 850 of them, prophets of Baal and Asherah, he had slain with the sword down by the brook Kishon. And she made the statement, she says, the gods do so to me and more also if I don't make his life, and he sent the message to Elijah, she did, if I don't make your life as one of theirs. Elijah was afraid, and he began to run away, ran south, all the way to the very southern edge of Israel, down to Beersheba. As a matter of fact, that's a long trek. That's more than a one-day journey. Jezreel, or Mount Carmel, is up in the northern sector of Israel, and he's now come all the way south. And we are told in the next line that he goes even a day's further journey to the south, and he sits under a broom tree or a juniper tree, the light, small shade that it provides, and he just complains to God. He says, I have not done any more than my fathers. Take away my life. I've had enough. And he comes to a depressed state of mind. Isn't there also times in your life, in my life, that we also have had the same type of feelings? I think so. That is, times in my life when I would have said, or you could have told me, you're not going to wake up in the morning except you'll wake up in eternity, and I might have said, that would have been fine with me. You probably have come to points like that in your life as well. Well, many Bible characters have had the same despondency, same depression, same types of low points in their lives as did Elijah and as do we. As a matter of fact, you think about 2 or 3 of them. For example, the man of Uz, the sage of Uz, Job. Job wished that he was not even alive at one point. He was suffering so greatly, but he was a great man of God. So also it was with Jeremiah. Jeremiah was told, by the way, how would this be a preaching lesson or a preaching commission? He was told when he goes to preach, he said, I want you to preach, and I want you to know the people are not going to obey. They're not going to come back to God, but I want you to preach it anyway. And the question we would raise is, why preach? Well, because it's right to do it. That's why, because it's right to preach the Word of God. But that would be a depressing note, and then it did come to a depressing state. When he was preaching one sermon in front of the priests, the high priest named Pashur came up, smacked him right in the face, and then he put him in stocks, and it brought Jeremiah down pretty low. He says, I wish that I was not even born. I wish I'd not even come to the place of being born at all. A lot of people in the Bible have gone through very depressing times. Jonah, was on the boat. He said, the problem is me. I know all of the problems that we are facing is me. Just toss me into the waters of the Mediterranean, and that'll be it. But of course, as you know, God spared his life. And so many people go through deep, dark passages of life, periods of despondency, and even lengthy periods which might be called depression. So what I want to do in two different segments here is look at, number one, some of the causes of that despondency, and we're looking at it through the life of Elijah. And then we'll look at what God has to say about it. That is, what kind of remedies does God have for sadnesses that we face. So let's think about the causes of Elijah's despair, first of all, causes of it. Number one would be physical exhaustion. Now think about the trek that he had made already. He had left Jezreel, where he had run to after Mount Carmel. He had gone all the way south, multi-day journey. I don't know how much food he did or did not have, but it was a long trek. And then he went south of Beersheba another day and sat under that broom tree and wished that he was dead. He was physically exhausted. And finally an angel came to him, brought him some bread, cruse of water, a little cake baked on the rocks, and said, you need to rise and eat. He was actually physically exhausted. Now there's an interesting passage in the New Testament I want you to notice, and it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and it begins at verse 24. Let's look at it for just a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and the verse is 24. Now, Paul is doing the writing, and the subject really involves his apostleship and what he is entitled to as an apostle, that is physical remuneration. But he makes this statement here, and beginning in verse 24, and we go right through verse 27. Know ye not that they that run in a race run all, but only one receives the prize? Even so, this is how I want you to run the race of Christianity. Even so run that you might attain. Are we running that way? And then he says, next line tells us, every man that contends in the games exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. Now he tells us, I therefore so run, not uncertainly, that is not aimlessly, I'm running for a goal. I therefore so run, not uncertainly, so fight I as not beating the air. But I buffet my body, that's the King James English, but it means I'm hard on my body, and I bring it under bondage. The wording there is I make my body a slave. That's interesting. I make my body a slave, lest by any means after I preach to others, I myself might be rejected. Christians make their bodies their slaves, and that is to say, we're not drawn around by all of the desires that we have. That's not the goal. Our goal is to control our bodies, control our appetites, and make our body a slave. But there is a fine line between having your body as your slave and controlling your appetites, no matter what they may be in life, controlling that and turning it around, and your body now is in so desperate need of nourishment that it makes your mind your slave, and your mind begins to say, I don't care if I live any longer. I don't care what happens now because I'm so depressed about it. And that's what happens with many people. Physical exhaustion, and the body controls their minds. Pretty sad, isn't it? There's another interesting passage in Mark chapter 2 to which I call your attention, thinking about physical exhaustion that happened with Elijah. And this statement is one that we might not think would apply, but I want you to track along with me for just a moment. It's in Mark 2, verses 27 and 28. And the context is Jesus has gone through on the Sabbath day and plucked ears of corn. And his disciples have plucked the ears, and they've rubbed them in their hands, and then they've eaten the corn, the kernels of corn. And the Pharisees, of course, said, that's work. That is defined as work on the Sabbath, and you violated the Sabbath. And in a lengthy discussion, our Lord makes several arguments discussing about what the Sabbath is about. And then he makes the statement in Mark chapter 2 now, verse 27. He said, the Sabbath is made for the man, and not man for the Sabbath. Now let's just explore that for a moment. The Sabbath is made for man. That is to say, simply, that God has made it for the benefit of mankind. In the Old Testament, Sabbath law was intact, and the Sabbath was for man's benefit. Man was to not work. He was to worship God upon that particular day. But here's something interesting also. The Old Testament has two renditions or two recordings of the Ten Commandments. One of them is Exodus chapter 20. The other recording of the Ten Commandments for the Sabbath command is the fourth command of the Decalogue, as you know. The second one is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and that's the one I want you to notice, Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 14. And he makes the statement here, God speaking to the people, he says that the Sabbath, he tells them, on the Sabbath, you're not to work, but it is for you and your servants to rest. God has carved out a particular day, setting aside, of course, the example of Creation Week, where God gave us that example. He has carved out a day for us to have rest. And we call it recreation. It means literally recreate. People need rest. People need to pay attention to the needs of their bodies. And so that's the main point. Elijah had not paid attention to it. He'd been on the run, and now he sat down and wished to die. Number two, think about this. On the other end of the spectrum, sometimes people become despondent because of inactivity. They just don't have things to do. A lot of men retiring from their jobs, forced to by the government, age 65 or whatever, they become depressed. They become sad. They want to find something to do, something that is proactive. They want to be able to think that they're moving ahead, that they're actually producing something worthwhile. And so they become depressed, kind of like Elijah was right here. Inactivity can destroy a person's mental health. It can destroy a person's spiritual health. Inactivity. Now, this is one thing that our modern culture simply ignores. You'll see how in just a moment. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and I believe the verse is 15, God says, through Solomon, he says that God has given you the benefit of work, that you might find pleasure in it. He wants you to find pleasure in work, not to say that. He wants you to have a job that you like as opposed to a job you don't like. But the idea is there is pleasure for the soul in work. God has created man so that he is to work, and women so that they are producing also. They must be busy, we must be active and in production. If we're not, then it becomes a point of despondency. This is something our modern today's government has completely ignored. They have actually bribed so many people with the welfare system to not work. And what's happened? Well, people become depressed. They become ugly in their behavior. They don't have enough to do. They're not working. And when Elijah got down here to the Mount Horeb, finally, which is Mount Sinai, God said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Well, the answer is nothing. Nothing. There's a point of despondency right there. Let's go to number 3, mental reaction. Sometimes mentally we become depressed, we become despondent because, as I say it this way, the bow has been bent too long. I have a recurve bow at the house. It's a 60-pound pull, but to put it up, the recurve bow, it's not like the compound bow, you know, where it has the wheels on it. It's 60 pounds. You have to pull it over and string it. But when you put it up, you don't keep it strung, because after a while, the strength of the bow is no longer as strong. It's not a 60-pound bow anymore. It simply breaks it down, so you have to unstring it when you put it up. And that is an illustration of what many people face, mental anguish. When you go through so much strain and stress, mental anguish, and even physical problems, when you go through it so long, sometimes the bow has been bent too long. And it's just too long bent, and it takes the strength out of that bow. It takes your strength out of your mental acuity. It's exactly what happens. So you think about people, for example, in history, in battle. I remember reading, for example, Robert E. Lee's army going up to Pennsylvania from Virginia. And as he traveled along the way, the men had been fighting all the while, and now they go up and they wanted to make an incursion into the Northern Territory. And he takes them up there to Pennsylvania. First of all, they were shocked because everything was fine. The life was going on as everybody had always done, and there was not war. But down in the South, everything was devastated. City of Nashville was burned to the ground. Many cities burned. And they were just devastated by that, but the long mental anguish of fighting over the war and then traveling, some of them would fall asleep off their horse. They would fall right on a fence post, and it would not even wake them up. That's hard to believe. It did just fall asleep. They'd be out. The mental anguish had been so strong that you couldn't even wake them up. Same thing regarding soldiers in Caesar's army. Caesar had one of the most successful armies. He is said to have won 1,000 battles, and he would board ships. One man, one of his generals, boarded a ship. All of them on the gangplank, they came up on it, and he rushed in with a sword. He got his right arm chopped completely off. He picked up the sword with his left hand and kept fighting. They had some kind of something that we don't have, I think, just be able to do that. But after a while, then you feel the pain. But in the battle itself, you don't feel the pain. Not as much, at least I'm told. Not been in battle, but after a while, then you feel the pain. Same thing regarding mental anguish. When our forefathers made and crafted the Constitution, they had spent a long time anguishing about how to word every clause of the Constitution. And it was a big mental strain on them. And after it was signed, many of them just sat down and cried. They just wept. The mental strain had been so long that now they were just letting it out. And so also with Elijah. It had been a mental strain. We honor him as a great hero, conquered at Mount Carmel, had all the prophets, false prophets, slain at the river Kishon. He had been taken care of by God at the Wadi Kerith, but now it had been too long, the bow had bent, and now it had mental strain, and now he is just actually crashing. Here's something else. Elijah felt his loneliness as well. He makes a statement here, and it says, I only am left, and they seek my life to take my life also. That was not true, by the way. God told him, I have 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal, but he felt like it was true. He felt like he was the only person that was left that was faithful to God. And sometimes we feel that way too. We feel like, okay, I'm alone. I don't have anybody beside me. I don't have anyone helping me. A lot of preachers have felt this way. Preachers have moved from congregation to congregation many times. You think, well, I don't know that anybody's supporting me at all. But that's kind of a lot of preachers sometimes, but that's what happened with Elijah. He felt he was alone, and loneliness can actually kill a person. Now, we are made to be gregarious, that is, people mixing with people, just like horses. They are herd animals. They have to have other horses around, and we have to have other people around to help us as well. I think about the Apostle Paul. He was in prison for the last time of his life, and he was about to give his life for the testimony of Jesus. And his last letter he writes is 2 Timothy. And I want you to notice a couple of lines in that letter. He tells us in chapter 1, verse 15, he says, all Asia has forsaken me. All Asia has rejected me. That is, he had preached all through Asia, and they had completely rejected him. Now, that didn't mean every person, because he had won many converts to Christ, but that's how he felt about it. All Asia had rejected him. Now he's in prison, and he makes this statement in chapter 4, verse 11. I want you to feel it, not just hear it. He said, only Luke is with me. I only have Luke here with me. That's it. Of all the labors, of all the conversions, of all the grand scenes of Paul preaching, now he's in prison by himself, and he says, in a lonely statement, only Luke is with me. Then he goes on to tell us this. At my first defense, no one took my part, but all forsook me. Then he adds this note, may it not be laid to their account. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, and I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Many times in life we feel very lonely. It may be true or not true. We may have people on our side, we may not. But the Lord stands by us, and loneliness really drives a person down low. That's what happened with Elijah. Lastly, I want you to notice he believed he was a failure. I think it's interesting to note that Elijah, after all the great things he had done, and the heroic actions he had undertaken in chapters 17 and 18, all of a sudden he feels like his life is a failure. And here's how he puts it: I'm no better than my fathers. It's a sobering time in life, isn't it? When you think, well, after I go, I don't think that I've made any difference at all. We all want to make a difference in life, don't we? We all want to make a positive push for something in life, for God, for Christ. We want to have made a difference, but he didn't feel like he'd made a difference at all. He said, no, I'm no better than my fathers. When it's all said and done, I have not made any difference. And my fathers didn't either. So now take away my life. Pretty sad, isn't it, to think that we have not made a difference at all. I'm reminded of the story of William Tyndall. I hope you know about William Tyndall. He's just one of the great, great heroes of the faith years ago. In the 16th century, William Tyndall was a translator of the Bible into English, but he was opposed by the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England both at his day. And he was in England, so he's translating the Bible. He had to leave England because the death sentence was given against him. The churches said, absolutely not. The common people will not have the Bible. That's been the Roman Catholic position for centuries. You're not going to have the Bible. They would have a Bible, by the way, they called it a chain Bible. It was chained to the building, like in the table or the lectern or something. It was chained up to the front of the building because they didn't want people to take it. They didn't have the Bible. And William Tyndall said, I'm going to make everybody so that they can read the Bible in their own tongue. It's not going to be in Latin. That's what they had, the Latin Vulgate. He said, I'm going to make it where they can read it in the English language. Well, he had to flee England. He went all over Europe, and they tried to track him down. The Pope sent out his army. He had all these Secret Service agents working for him, and they were going to get him. One time, he fled from the printer's shop. It was so close that he had to leave all of his translations right there on the table, and he had to leave out the back door. And he had to start all over again. That's how close it was. So finally, he stayed in a castle, and he was in this castle for a period of time, and he was actually tutoring the children in the scriptures in the particular castle. And they told him, you don't go out of the castle, because out of the castle, inside the castle is where you have amnesty, but outside, we can't protect you. And the Roman Catholic Church is going to get you, and they've said they're going to kill him. Well, William Tyndall would go out every weekend. He'd take all the money that he had. He dressed in a cloak, put it over his face, over his head, and then he went out into the streets and he gave his money to the poor people. They told him, you better not go out of the castle. Well, one day, they did find out where he was. They sent an inside man, the Roman Catholic Church sent an inside man into the castle. They discovered what he was doing outside, and when he got out, they arrested him. They took him to the stake, and they burned him at the stake alive. The crime was translating the Bible into the English tongue. And he thought that he was absolutely a failure. He cried when he was being burned to death. He says, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. He didn't think that he had any impact on the world at all. But you know what? The translations of the Bible that we have, we owe it a lot to William Tyndall. He didn't live to see it, but he had an impact. And you have an impact also, even though we do not necessarily see it. Story of William Tyndall, one of the great stories of history. Let's look at how God deals with despondency. There are several things that we need to know. The first two, just we might look at them in tandem together. That is, he gave Elijah sleep, and he provided him with food. Remember, Elijah came down to that broom tree below Beersheba, a day's journey south, slept under it, and when the angel came, he was asleep. This is interesting. The angel provided him food. It was a baked cake on coals, and there was a cruse of water right there. And he told him, he finally shook him awake. He said, I want you to get up and eat. He ate some food, drank some water. He went back asleep. God allowed him to sleep again. And finally, he woke him up and said, you know what? I want you to eat some more because the journey's too long for you. And so Elijah takes off and goes south. The next point is he goes on a hallowed journey, number 3. A hallowed journey. The journey hallowed means, of course, it has holy implications. He goes to Mount Sinai, and the travel takes him 40 days and 40 nights. Now, I don't know that it really takes that long to travel, even if you're on foot 40 days and 40 nights to get there. But that's how long it took, and that, of course, is reminiscent of when Moses led the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, and they came to Mount Sinai, and they stayed there 40 days and 40 nights. And that's exactly what we have at Mount Sinai. So it took him that long to get there, and when he came to it, he came to a cave. It may have been the very cave where Moses stood. You remember what Moses asked the Lord? Moses came to a cave. It was actually called a cleft in the rock. And he said, he asked God, I want to see God. I want to see you. So God said, I'll tell you what, you stand in the cave, in the cleft of this rock, I'm going to pass by. And he put his hand over his face as he passed, and then as he went on, he was able to see the back of God. That was all that Moses was able to see. But it was a hallowed place. It was a hallowed site. People today still go to the place called Jebel Musa, Mountain of Moses, and remember Mount Sinai, where the law had been given. It was good for Elijah to go and remember the law of God. And that's exactly what the point simply is. God sends us on a hallowed journey, and that is back to His Word. When we are in despondency and when we're in despair, it's always good to go back to the Bible, back to that place where we have firm footing. I think about this passage in Jeremiah, chapter 6. A famous statement that Jeremiah makes is verse 16. Jeremiah, the prophet I mentioned earlier in the lesson, told to preach, no one's going to listen to you. But in chapter 6 and verse 16, Jeremiah is addressing the people, and here's what he says. I want you to stand at the crossroads, and I want you to select the ancient paths, for therein is the good way. I think the King James says, select the old path. Stand at the crossroads, that is, there's more than one way to go, and I want you to select the old paths, the ancient paths, that's the good way. Now, what did that mean? Well, for people in Jeremiah's day, they didn't need a new revelation in the sense of a new law from God. They didn't need more law. What they needed to do was pay attention to what God had already said. By the way, I think the same thing regarding our own generation. So many people today call themselves prophets and think about prophecies supposedly that God gives them today, and they want some new revelation. The problem is not that we don't have new revelation. The problem is we don't pay attention to the revelation that has been given. And that's exactly what Jeremiah was telling them. I want you to select the old paths. Go to the old paths. Go to the ancient paths. And go to God's holy word. And so in times of despondency and lowness, Jeremiah tells the people, and he himself, it applies to him, go to the ancient paths. Therein, you're going to find the good way. And finally, God gave Elijah a duty. Remember, I pointed out that one of the causes of despondency and despair is that we have nothing productive to do. Well, that's what was going on with Elijah, so God told him, I've got something for you to do. Number one, several things, by the way. Number one, you're going to go up to Syria. That would be an enemy territory, northeast of Israel, and you're going to anoint Hazael king in place of Ben-Hadad. Then also, you're going to anoint Jehu king in the place of the house of Omri. And then he says, you're going to find, and this may have been a reproach, halfway a reproach to Elijah. He said, you're going to find a successor to you yourself, and that man is Elisha. You have something to do. You have a task to perform. Go do it. And so Elijah leaves. So how are we to deal with sadness, despondency, depression? There are tasks for us to do. We have to look back. Ancient paths. What does the Word of God say? Look back. That gives us direction, doesn't it? When we look back, we can now know which direction we're headed. Look back, but there are things for us to do here. And we need to be productive. Sometimes we don't feel like it. There are times I don't feel like doing what I do. Sometimes I don't feel like preaching. I say that to people, like, what? No, sometimes I don't feel like it. But there are tasks to be done, lessons to be given, people to be won, and we have to engage ourselves and our minds and mental acuity in the task of the Lord. And when we do, then despondency leaves. Sadness disappears. There's nothing worse than sitting down, as Elijah did, and saying, I'm left alone. They've killed all the prophets. I'm left alone, and I want you to take my life. That doesn't lead to anything, does it? God gave him something to do. There are things for you to do also. The lesson is yours if you're subject to the invitation by belief, repentance, baptism into Christ. That's the wording of Mark 16 and 16. God takes you out of the world and puts you into his family. Baptism into Christ, Galatians 3:27. If you're subject to the invitation, come while we stand and sing right now.